And I'm very honored to be giving this talk, and thanks to the organizers for such a stimulating conference, and thank you all for coming. Inequality, as Fulya said, has been receiving increasing importance. It has been receiving increasing attention, including academic attention. Thomas Piketty's book on the sources of inequality became a bestseller in 2013 in France, then in the United States and Britain in 2014, because it offered an explanation for rising inequalities that we're all witnessing. Its central message is that societies inexorably become more unequal because the rate of return on capital generally exceeds the rate of growth. And this imbalance leads to greater concentration of capital, and only a major breakdown undoes the concentration process. Here's a figure from the book, which may be familiar to you. It shows the evolution of the top deciles income share in the United States. And then the top 1%, the top 0.1%, the top 0.01%, and so on. The stock market crash, you see here, lowered the top 10% and the top 1% share of income. And again, there was a shock during the World War II, but the concentration process resumed in the 1970s, and says Piketty, nothing will stop this except a systemic breakdown. A book just out entitled The Great Leveler offers massive evidence supporting Piketty's thesis going back all the way to the Stone Age. With few exceptions, this new book says every society becomes more unequal while at peace. Wars are levelers, as are bloody revolutions, but as soon as a war ends and stability is achieved, or a revolution overthrows the old order and the new regime settles in, inequality starts climbing once again. Now, I finished reading The Great Leveler, as it happens, on the way from the United States to Barcelona, and it reminded me of a book published in 1982 by Mansur Olson. In the 1980s, few economists were interested in inequality. People were concerned with low growth and unemployment. In keeping with the times, Olson wrote about efficiency rather than inequality. He argued that in societies that are in peace, coalitions impose anti-competitive regulations, which brings down growth. Only a breakdown, he said, caused by defeat in war or a revolution would do away with the inefficiencies and raise growth levels. And his major example was Japan and Germany, the two vanquished countries in World War II that were growing more rapidly at the time than the victors, France, Britain, and the United States. Now, I was struck 3 years ago in reading Piketty, and then in reading Ciutadella just very recently, that they're talking about two sides of the same coin. Olson's inefficiency-generating rules are rules that benefit the top 10 disproportionately, and the top 1% very disproportionately, and the top 0.01% very, very, very disproportionately. So they're talking about the same thing, but emphasizing different aspects of the same the problem and reaching the same conclusion. They all follow, that is Piketty, Ciutadella, and Olson, they all posit a fundamental source of inequality in human civilization, one that applies to all societies, ancient and modern, agrarian and industrial, rich and poor. There are also sources of inequality that are specific to pre-modern societies or specific to societies today that have not completed the transition from personal exchange, which is characteristic of pre-modern societies, to impersonal exchange, which is characteristic of advanced societies. In other words, that have not completed the process we call economic modernization. It is several such mechanisms that I want to discuss today in explaining why the Middle East has been a late modernizer and why it continues to lag economically and why it contributes in a major way to global inequality through its persistent underdevelopment. And I'll be arguing that certain historical inequalities and inefficiencies are responsible for certain patterns that we observe today. To motivate the mechanisms I'm going to be developing, let me start with the voluntary exchange process, which is central to human civilization. Exchange depends critically on trust. Suppose that my house needs to be repainted. I'm able to hire a paint crew to do the job because the crew trusts me to pay for their work. You can think of me as A and the paint crew as B. The workers also know that if I don't pay them at the end of the work, they can take me to a court that will come after me. They know at the end of the work that I do pay them, that I give them a check, that the check will be honored by the bank. They also trust that when they go to cash the check, the piece of paper that we call money that they get from the bank will carry some value. So two distinct forms of trust simplify, even enable the exchange process. Interpersonal trust, which is the paint crew's trust in me, and trust in impersonal institutions, for example, the crew's trust in the courts, in the banking system, in money. And that is not all that trust does. Members of the paint crew trust that the company, their own company, will pay them for their work. I trust that the paint company will use safe, unleaded paint. I trust that if the work is unsatisfactory, that I can call up the company and the company will come and address the issues promptly and so on. So in the absence of trust, transaction costs would be prohibitively high and markets would not function. If this seems obvious, it is because a generation of social scientists have supplied the empirical and theoretical foundations. It was news to most economists, at least, when in 1972, Kenneth Arrow wrote, "It can plausibly be argued that much of the economic backwardness in the world can be explained by the lack of mutual confidence." Since the 1970s, a huge and very diverse literature has emerged that links trust to economic performance. It tells us that capital flows out of low trust regions and into high trust regions where transaction costs are lower. High trust regions tend to have lower corruption, better governance, better contract enforcement, and they tend to be richer. The studies that reach these conclusions tend to measure interpersonal trust through some variant of the World Values Survey question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful in dealing with people? Using this question in cross-country work is problematic because exact translation of this question is impossible. Nevertheless, the global index that is based on this question, by and large, validates Arrow's institution. We had the low scores for Africa, for Latin America, for India, for Russia, for the Middle East, relative to the OECD, are in line with our general sense that trust is, these are places where trust is relatively low. A surprise is that many people argue over, try to explain, and still don't have a satisfactory explanation, is this figure, extremely high figure for for China. There's also an index measuring trust in institutions. The country coverage here is much more limited. Most of Africa is missing, as is most of the Middle East. At this level of aggregation, it's hard to make sense of these figures. We don't yet have studies, as far as I know, of how various components of this index, trust in government, for example, trust in media, how these are linked to growth. I'm just pointing this out to draw attention to a void in the literature. Fortunately, work on the role of trust in economic development is not dependent on survey questions alone. There are other ways of quantifying trust, and I'm going to provide some highlights with a focus on the Middle East of very low trust in the region. For the purposes of this talk, the Middle East consists of the entire Arab world plus Iran and Turkey, in other words, the historical core of the Islamic world. This region was governed under Islamic law, loosely we know as the Sharia. It was governed by Islamic law until the early 20th century. I'm then going to turn to the question of why trust is so low in the Middle East. And I'll take 20 minutes or so suggesting several historical mechanisms that account for the Middle East's trust deficit. And then I'll end with some policy implications. As an alternative to survey questions, levels of trust and trustworthiness can be compared through laboratory experiments. An excellent example is a paper by Bonnet, Herman, and Zeckhauser. They conduct trust games on subject pools assembled in 3 Arab Gulf countries, Kuwait, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, and 2 Western countries, Switzerland and the United States. This is a game in which a principal can divide a pot of money between himself and someone else. Alternatively, he can turn this over to the agent, who also will be able to divide a pot of money, except the pot will grow. The catch is that if you turn it over to the principal, you turn it over to the agent may distribute the money equally, in which you will both gain, but he can also decide on an unequal distribution that leaves you with less 8 as opposed than you would get if you did the division yourself. In other words, to trust here, to trust an agent to do the division, is to take a risk. The person that you trust may prove himself untrustworthy. So do Arabs play, the question is, do Arabs play the game any differently from the Swiss and the Americans? Indeed, Arab principles require a greater probability that the agent will prove trustworthy. And the reason is that in the Arab world, the cost of betrayal is relatively high. The institutions to which one can turn for help in response to breach of contract are weak. This decreases trust outside of social networks. In effect, Emiratis, Kuwaitis, and Omanis require greater levels of trustworthiness before they will trust. And they obtain that trust by getting to know you, okay? And getting to know you, of course, is a costly process. And if you have to get to know somebody before you will trust them, before you will exchange with them, before you will do business with them, there a series of potentially profitable trades that you're going to give up. The Swiss and Americans are substantially less averse to betrayal because they come from societies where contract breakers can be forced generally to pay damages. through experiments conducted in Cairo, Binzel and Furr find further evidence of a low trust equilibrium in the region that inhibits profitable exchanges. They use a within subject design that involves having Cairene subjects play a variant of the trust game that we just saw a moment ago. Specifically, this is a binary trust game with hidden action. The principal's choice is the same. The principal can make the division himself or turn it over to an agent. Okay. If the agent decides, this is what's different, if the agent decides to cooperate, there is the good outcome for the principal is not guaranteed. There is a non-trivial probability, it's 1/6 in this case, where the principal will still get the low payoff. In other words, the low payoff here is 4, what he would get if the agent decided not to cooperate, okay? If the agent proved untrustworthy. And and here, this is also important, if the principal gets the low payoff, if the principal gets 4, the principal cannot tell whether this happened because there was a betrayal or there was an unlucky draw, okay? That the hidden action produced an unlucky outcome. This experiment produces 2 findings relevant here. First of all, the principals exhibit higher trust when they play with friends than when they play with strangers, and people underestimate the trustworthiness of agents. A substantial share of the plays end up with inefficient outcomes because of unrealistically low trust, both in friends and in strangers. Again, the implication of this paper, as well as of some other papers that are built on these 2 papers I'm discussing, is that profitable trades fail to materialize in the region because of low trust. Before experimental evidence, economic anthropologists were reaching the same conclusion. Their methods involve close observation and thick description. In this case, what they observe is how business gets done in the Middle East and in other places, okay, and how people interact with each other and through organizations. If you are in Helsinki, they tell us, and you need to get something from a state agency, what do? You inquire about the appropriate procedures, what forms need to be filled out, and other such formalities. Finland is, of course, a very, very high trust society. Finns believe that when they follow procedures, the agency will treat them fairly and do what's necessary. In Cairo, you don't bother typically with finding out the procedures. You look for an insider. And if you don't know an insider who can pull strings at this particular agency, you ask your friends and find a friend who knows an insider, puts you in touch with the insider. Who you know, of course, in this environment matters critically. For a building permit, you seek somebody with influence. For help with a neighborhood traffic problem, again, you look for an insider in the traffic department and so on. You don't pursue your rights as a tax-paying citizen as you would in Finland. Now, in getting to a friend to help you out, you turn your relationship with the Egyptian state agency, which is an impersonal organization that you don't trust in this case, you turn it into a personal exchange between people who do trust each other. You and then somebody who's a connection that somebody you know in the agency, or a good friend of yours. You get some insider connected to you to do you a favor, and of course the expectation is that you will reciprocate when that person needs help. You will reciprocate by perhaps finding their nephew a job or something of that nature. Now, the personalism of exchange in the Middle East is a source of underdevelopment. In contexts where exchange is now largely impersonal in developed societies, it shifts rewards from people with, it shifts rewards to people with connections. It rewards certain social skills that create private benefits but not wealth. It also dampens the rewards to hard work and creativity. It reduces organizational efficiency because the same thing that I described is happening within organizations. When people try to navigate within an organization, people try to manage the tasks given to them. It makes the economies of the Middle East less efficient than those with which they compete globally. The personalism of exchange is also a source of political instability in weakening the rule of law in favor of the wealthy who are able to pull strings, who have better connections. It reduces the legitimacy of the political system, which indirectly then undermines wealth creation. Now, one should not jump to the conclusion that this is a permanent feature of the Middle East. After all, exchange has not been predominantly impersonal in societies that are now economically developed. Exchange has not been predominantly impersonal in Finland for thousands and thousands of years. It's a relatively recent development. A millennium ago, personal exchange was the norm everywhere. People did business primarily with acquaintances. Trust in strangers was very limited. Interregional trade was carried out only by certain networks that specialized in creating trust among network members. The fostering of trust on a broader scale, trust in organizations and trust in government, is a later development. Impersonal exchange is among the products of the economic modernization process. In the late Middle Ages, that process began in certain parts of Western Europe, and it then spread first to the rest of Western Europe and to places settled predominantly by Europeans, such as the United States. The Middle East is among the laggards in regard to economic modernization. It is only in the 19th century that it began the transformation that took many centuries elsewhere in other places. Some parts of the region, such as the Arabian Gulf, where one of these experiments took place, they started this process that began 1,000 years ago in England and Holland, only in the 1930s. Now, given the immense delay, the region has actually come quite a long way in just a few generations. Nevertheless, in regard to the exchange process, it remains in transition between medieval and modern economic life. Its patterns of trust and business procedures involve a mixture of modern institutions, such as state agencies and private corporations, and medieval practices using personal exchange instead of following impersonal procedures. So, why is trust low in the Middle East? Why has the transition to impersonal exchange been delayed? The reasons, I'd like to argue, are historical. The pre-industrial economic institutions of the Middle East were very well suited to the environments in which economic interactions occur almost exclusively among people who have reasons to trust each other. But those same institutions prevented the development of generalized trust, which is trust in strangers, trust in organizations, trust in government. They prevented generalized trust from developing from within the Middle East and from developing especially in the Arab world. Some traditional institutions went further in that they incentivized people to break formal, impersonal, or less personal contracts. I'm going to discuss three of these in turn. They have to do with the scale of organization in the private economy, the biases of Islamic law, and the weaknesses of civil society. And then I'll end, as I said, with the policy implications given the weaknesses that I'm going to identify. So in the medieval Middle East, as in medieval Europe, individuals pooled resources to finance and operate trade ventures and production operations through partnerships. Partnerships were temporary enterprises formed by individuals who trusted each other, though courts were available in case they had disputes that needed to be resolved. An investor financed, for example, a long-distance trader's trip. When the trip was over, and the profits would be shared, and the enterprise would then cease to exist. Partnerships were small in membership. Most had no more than 2 members, and they were ephemeral. Most of them lasted less than 3 months. They had no legal existence apart from its membership. If a partner died, the partnership was null and void. In the 19th century, indigenous enterprises in the Middle East were still operating as they did a millennium earlier. There were no permanent for-profit enterprises, no business corporations, in other words, no companies with a legal standing apart from the individuals who financed and did the work. There were no companies or enterprises that fit the definition of what in economics we call the firm. In the intervening millennium, Europe had generated the joint stock company and then the business corporation. European merchants, investors, customers, and suppliers all grew accustomed over many centuries to dealing with large and permanent organizations. Meanwhile, the legal system developed and evolved to accommodate organizations alongside individuals as legal parties. Trust in organizations and government developed in tandem. This happened organically and gradually. Why institutional development in Europe and the Middle East diverged is a question that I've addressed, has fascinated me, and that I've addressed in various works. Just briefly, and I can go into more details in Q&A, the Islamic inheritance system is highly egalitarian, which means that in case a partner died before a partnership was over, you had to deal with many heirs, okay? And the transaction costs were high of reallocating the resources. Your own capital could get tied up in the process, so to avoid these possible potential transaction costs, you formed small partnerships of short duration. Another problem was that Islamic law lacks the concept of a corporation. Forming a corporation instead of a partnership was not an alternative, and to make things worse, there were attractive non-commercial investment opportunities. You could form trusts that are called waqfs, whose assets were free of taxation and relatively protected from expropriation. The key point is that in the Middle East, it was not until the late 19th century, and in some places not until the early 20th century, that the business corporation, the modern firm, entered domestic legal systems. Not until then could you sue a company in an indigenous court. You could sue individuals. You could do this going back hundreds of years, going back to the Middle Ages. You could not sue the company that they represented. Even the courts treated exchanges involving companies, exchanges involving waqfs, trusts, that could be very large, as personal exchanges. Now, eventually, there were legal reforms. A law of corporations was put in place in Turkey in 1908 and in Egypt shortly thereafter, and eventually everywhere else. Resistance to the reforms, to these reforms at least, was minimal. The corporation was accepted without much fuss, but trust in corporations is something else. Peoples of the region are still learning to trust corporations. Courts are still learning to separate corporate interests from personal interests. The efficiency gains from corporations have not fully materialized yet. The central point is that the region is still learning to deal with impersonal exchange. Here's a visual timeline, what I'm loosely calling Islamic law, developed in this period, essentially the rise of Islam to the 9th, perhaps the 10th century. This corresponds to the period when earliest corporations are being established in Europe. About 4,000 in this period, about 4,000 cities in Europe declare themselves as corporations. Thousands of religious orders declare themselves as corporations. Monasteries do the same. Eventually, the universities are established in this period as corporations. The first business corporations, what we call the firm, they emerge in 1600. It's not until 1900 that any of these developments occur, involving the corporation occur in the Middle East. This is when the region gets laws that allow impersonal exchange to take place formally among indigenous people without involving foreign institutions such as foreign courts that are established in the region through foreign consulates. So what I want you to get out of here is that Europe has had 1,000 more years of experience with impersonal law and with legal personhood and impersonal exchange. Let me turn now to another historical cause of low trust in the region. It too has to do with Islamic law. Until a century ago, in the Middle East, commercial and financial contracts were enforced through Islamic courts. These courts followed procedures that were substantially biased in favor of three groups. First group was elites with friends in high places, and this is because judges were appointed and dismissed at will by the Sultan or the Sultan's representatives, depending on the part of the Middle East. In trials pitting elites against commoners, judges tilted verdicts in favor of elites unless the evidence in favor of the commoners was overwhelming. Islamic courts, secondly, were biased in favor of men. Judges and their staffs were exclusively male, so they saw cases through male eyes. Male witnesses were preferred, heavily preferred, because the judicial system considered them more credible. And the courts were biased, thirdly, in favor of Muslims and against non-Muslims. In the Middle East, this typically meant Christians and Jews. Prior to industrialization, the share of non-Muslims could be, depending on the region, 20, 30, 40% in major commercial centers. The courts were biased in favor of Muslims, partly because their staffs consisted exclusively of Muslims, but also because non-Muslims, under the procedures of these courts, non-Muslims were not allowed to testify against Muslims, though there was no analogous restriction for Muslims. Now, why does this matter? It had huge implications for trust and trustworthiness, and therefore for interregional inequality. The biases in favor of elites, men, and Muslims meant that if members of these groups broke a contract and you had to sue them, your chances of getting restitution were compromised. if you lent, say, to a male Muslim, your chances of getting the courts to force repayment if the lender decided not to repay were lower than if you lent to a female Christian, let us say. There's more to it. Precisely because the courts were less likely to enforce the contract, the male Muslim borrowers had an incentive to default, was more likely to default in a pinch. So male Muslims were relatively untrusted, and they were actually relatively untrustworthy because of systemic incentives. Now, this did not mean that the legally privileged groups could not borrow. There were credit markets. What it meant, and everybody could participate in the credit market. What this meant is that these privileged groups, Muslims, men, and elites, paid a premium for their privileges. Their privileges that made them less trustworthy. So in work that has just been published with Jared Rubin, we've actually looked at the credit markets over a 2-century period in Istanbul, and these are what you see here is a table from a chart from the paper. It shows that the average real interest rate was 19%, which was, by the way, quite high for the period. In this period in Holland and England, the real interest rate is about 8-9%. So that is a separate story. Again, it's pointing to rather inefficient financial markets. But what we're interested in here is the differences between the privileged groups, which are the groups in green, and the unprivileged. You see that the privileged groups, these are just the raw, this is the raw data. What you see is that in each case the privileged group pays more, and when you actually study this empirically and control for all the loan characteristics and so on, what you find is that the privileged group pay between 15 and about 40% more, depending on the group. And we can actually break this down for the elites. We can break down elites who are connected to the palace, elite merchants, and so on. Their premia differ depending on the category. When you control for loan characteristics, they pay a very substantial premium. Okay. Now, as the modern global economy took shape and credit became increasingly critical to economic success, that happens just right after our period right here. Okay, the Industrial Revolution happens right after this period. The patterns that you see here turned into a handicap for Muslims. In sectors where raising capital was important to the success, success, Muslims could not compete with non-Muslims or with Europeans. The group that had the hardest time borrowing were the elites. Elites would not lend to other elites. They preferred lending to commoners because, and the elites were the people you'd expect if industrialization was to occur here. They were the people who had the capital. So Muslims fell behind in capital accumulation, in developing business skills, and in establishing a business reputation. The Islamic courts are gone almost everywhere, though the Islamic State has restored them in a few places in Iraq and Syria. The Taliban has restored them in Afghanistan, but everywhere else they're gone. But their effects on these patterns of trust endures. Interpersonal trust is low in the region, partly because of its legal history. The third and final pattern that I'm going to discuss, this common to the Middle East, is weak civil society. Civil society refers to the collectivity of associations that people form outside the family, the state, and the commercial sector to advance common interests. It's played a vital role in every successful democratization process, which is central to the equalization of resources and incomes. The checks and balances that are essential to democracy come partly from private associations that put up resistance when their interests are threatened. They block authoritarian tendencies that exist in every government. They also build trust because people feel protected by the private associations that they belong to. It's often observed that Middle Eastern monarchs and presidents emasculate the news media, suppress intellectual inquiry, ban political parties, and so on. These authoritarian policies, it is said, account for the weakness of civil society and by implication for low trust, but causality goes both ways here. Rulers can pursue oppressive policies for decades on end because civil society is weak in the first place. Modern political and economic institutions were superimposed in the Middle East on a pre-industrial institutional complex that was poorly suited to democratization in the first place. A key element of that complex was the Islamic trust known as the Waqf. In the pre-modern Middle East, practically all social services were provided through Waqfs, not by local governments, which was the pattern in Western Europe going back to the Middle Ages. And municipalities were corporations. They were established. Many cities had these already in the Middle Ages. This difference had enormous consequences down to the present. In Europe, local governance promoted democratization by equipping people with the skills to organize, to make their wishes known, and to hold officials accountable. In the Middle East, limited democratization, or the Waqf limited democratization by keeping such skills underdeveloped. It also limited the development of civil society. Waqfs controlled a lot of resources for the benefit of various groups. The use of the resources was set by the founders. The managers of Waqfs did not have to pay attention. By law, they didn't have to pay any attention to the preferences of the beneficiaries. This limited political participation. Waqfs could not pool resources with other entities, so they formed no durable political coalitions, and they hardly ever tried. Waqfs limited political participation further by denying their beneficiaries a say in the selection of officers. Each officer appointed his or her successor. He was not accountable to the people he served. So in the modern Middle East, the local governments, municipalities in cities, they have taken over functions that were once performed by Waqfs. Nevertheless, the effects of the Waqf are still with us. The weakness of civil society results in part from the lack of organizational skills, the absence of a custom of accountability, and a lack of a tradition of forming private political coalitions to pursue private causes. All of these are rooted, I'd like to suggest, in the way that the Middle East provided itself public goods until recent times, from the Middle Ages down to the present. I can skip this this time. I've tried to point out that the reasons for low trust in the Middle East are very deep. They're rooted in the region's history of commercial and financial relationships and in the financing of public goods. That means, unfortunately, that there are no quick fixes for the region's problems. Promoting private organizations, getting regimes to relax their restrictions on private society will help, but it will be a slow process, even in places that are more or less at peace. Where the rule of law is missing, it can be imposed by outsiders, assuming they're willing to bear the cost. A foreign power can impose on an underdeveloped society its own laws or a new set of laws, or it can start enforcing the existing laws. If necessary, it can bring in foreign experts to do this. This happened in certain places when Europeans formed colonial empires. French governors, bureaucrats, soldiers, and judges maintain or help maintain the rule of law in French colonies. After World War I, the French imposed laws on Syria, the British imposed laws on Iraq, to just give two examples. With trust, outsiders have much less leverage than they do with the rule of law. If members of society don't trust each other as individuals, you can't make them do so easily or quickly. They have to learn this through experience. That said, rule of law can help. It can create the conditions under which trust develops over the long run. And there are basically two complementary mechanisms that lead from an environment of low generalized trust to a high generalized trust environment. And we can call them the civic pathway and the commercial pathway. The first pathway relies on the development of civic life. The classic argument was made by Robert Putnam, a political scientist, in Making Democracy Work. The empirical setting is Italy in this book, where government in the north is much more efficient than government in the south. The north is also substantially richer, and it is a place where generalized trust is relatively higher. Decades of reforms have failed. Formal institutions, the laws and system of governance are similar in the north and south. What differs is the informal institutions, the customs, the norms, the habits, the attitudes that can't be legislated. And these include various forms of trust, and the differences in levels of trust mean that the same formal institutions yield different outcomes in the south than the north. One of the measurable differences between southern and northern Italy is that civic life is substantially more lively in the north, as measured by participation in civic associations. In the south, participation is hampered by mistrust among individuals in government and organizations. That's a key reason why resource transfers over many decades from the north to the south have not closed the interregional gap, and why government regulations that work quite well in northern Italy and contribute to the prosperity of northern Italy don't do the same in the south. Trust cannot be established by outsiders, let me emphasize, and it cannot emerge overnight. This is a long process, and I think the difficulties that southern Italy has faced, support this. The second policy tool involves trade, and again, I'll bring up the Edgeworth box to illustrate it. At least since Adam Smith, economics has promoted the idea that trade promotes the efficient use of resources. Much less emphasized today is the contributions to trade to the personal traits of traders. When people trade successfully, they create the trust needed to facilitate further trade among them and to facilitate cooperation in various areas. So there's a virtuous circle at play. Albert Hirschman wrote about this. In The Passions and the Interest, he documents that the great thinkers of the 17th and 18th century who preceded Adam Smith promoted trade like Adam Smith, but for a different reason. They promoted trade not for its allocational benefits, but for its political consequences. Trade tames people's destructive impulses, they said. It makes people more trustworthy, which then make people update their expectations and trust potential partners more. Soumitra Jha in a recent paper, makes an analogous point through an empirical analysis of modern India. His specific question is why in the Gujarat, ethnic violence is more common in some places than others. And the explanation is that in places where ethnic groups historically traded with each other, and in this case, we're talking about ethno-religious groups, Muslims and Hindus, most of the riots occur between these two groups. What he finds is that in places where these groups traded with each other historically, in the old trade towns, there's much more tolerance today. You see far fewer riots. And there's less interethnic mistrust, and you find more cooperation across religious lines. The essence of the argument is that of Hirschman. Jha points out that in towns characterized by trade, the ethnic groups had complementary skills that encouraged trade, and this trade then, over many centuries, caused trust to develop. Even in places where professions have changed entirely, the economy has changed entirely, that trust that was created many centuries ago still survives. Right. So it's time to wrap up. My last slide. Inequality has been a major theme of this conference. I started out by pointing to fundamental sources of global and national inequality. Then I distinguished these from sources of inequality that are rooted in region-specific or nation-specific institutions. Inequalities rooted in historical institutions are not permanent. They can be overcome. This is the good news of my talk, okay? So it's not all, it's not all pessimism as you get in the three books I introduced first, but there's also some bad news. These effects, because of the historical sources of the problems we observe today, the effects these problems cannot be wiped out overnight. We should keep our eyes on long-term effects, the long-term results of the policies we implement, such as the results that you get in the long run when you promote trade, for example. We are very aware of the short-term consequences, the increase in wealth that trade generates, but there's also a usually unrecorded, unobserved benefit, long-run benefit, which is greater trust. And we should keep our eyes on these long-term effects of policies. Thank you.